My name is Margaret, and I have learned that time does not always move forward the way we imagine it will. Sometimes it circles back. Sometimes it waits quietly inside ordinary objects. And sometimes, when you least expect it, a simple thing, a folded piece of paper, a forgotten pocket, a familiar scent, can bring the past rushing back so quickly that your heart doesn't have time to prepare. It happened on a quiet afternoon when the house felt particularly still. Not the peaceful kind of stillness, but the kind that makes you notice every small sound, the ticking of the clock, the soft creak of wood beneath your feet, the faint hum of a refrigerator that has been working faithfully for years. The sky outside my window was pale and gentle, as if it too was moving slowly. I had decided to clean out my wardrobe. It sounds like such a harmless decision, doesn't it? One of those practical tasks older people do when they want to feel useful. I told myself I would sort coats, fold scarves, and maybe give a few things away. But really, I think I was looking for something else. A distraction, a sense of control, a way to organize not just my closet, but the feelings that can gather quietly in the corners of a lonely week. I opened the wardrobe doors, and the scent of fabric and time drifted out. It wasn't unpleasant, it was simply old, the smell of wool, dust, and years of winters. My eyes moved along the row of coats, each one holding a memory that belonged to a different version of me. Some were worn and soft from years of use. Some still held their shape, stubbornly refusing to collapse into age. Then, my hand stopped at one particular coat. It was not the fanciest coat I owned. It wasn't the warmest. But it had always been my favorite because it belonged to a chapter of my life I still held gently in my heart. The fabric was dark and thick, the collar slightly worn. I hadn't worn it in a long time. When I lifted it from the hanger, it felt heavier than I remembered. I carried it to the bed and laid it down carefully, smoothing the sleeves as if I were preparing it for something important. That was when I noticed how the pocket sagged slightly, as if something was inside. At first, I assumed it was nothing, maybe an old tissue, a coin, a button, the kinds of things that collect in pockets when you've lived long enough to forget what you placed there. I slid my hand into the pocket. My fingers touched paper. Not a receipt, not a tissue, a folded letter. I froze. My hand tightened around it as if it might disappear if I loosened my grip. I pulled it out slowly and stared at it in my palm. The paper was yellowed with age, creased carefully, softened at the edges, like it had been opened and closed more than once long ago. For a moment, I could only sit there. I wasn't sure why my heart had started beating faster. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was something more complicated, the sudden awareness that I was holding a piece of the past that had been waiting for me. I unfolded it slowly, like someone opening a fragile relic. The handwriting on the page felt like a voice, a familiar voice, one that made my throat tighten before I even read the words. My fingers trembled, not because my hands are old, but because my heart suddenly felt young again, young enough to be hurt, young enough to hope. I recognized the handwriting instantly. It belonged to my husband. For a long moment, my eyes couldn't move. They stayed fixed on the first line, as if reading it would change something I wasn't ready to change. The ink had faded slightly, but the words were still clear, and it was as if time itself had leaned close to whisper, "My darling Margaret." The room blurred. I pressed my lips together, trying to hold myself steady. I hadn't heard him call me that in years, not with his voice, not with that softness. And yet here it was, his love written down, waiting in my coat pocket like a secret. I began to read. He wrote about ordinary things, about the way I laughed when I was surprised, about the way I hummed while cooking without realizing it, about the warmth of my hands in winter. He wrote about how proud he was of the home we had built, not because it was perfect, but because it was ours. He wrote about gratefulness, the simple kind, the kind that doesn't need big words. And with every sentence, the past wrapped tighter around me. I saw him in the kitchen again, sleeves rolled up, washing dishes, even though he always pretended he didn't like doing it. I saw him sitting in his chair, reading the newspaper, glancing up at me as if my presence alone made the room complete. I saw the way he would reach for my hand without thinking, like it was a natural part of breathing. The memories were not sharp. They were warm, but warmth can hurt when you've been cold for too long. Halfway through the letter, my vision filled with tears. I tried to blink them away. I tried to keep reading as if I was strong enough to hold the past without breaking. But the tears kept coming, quiet tears, the kind that don't make a sound but still feel like they're shaking something loose inside your chest. I held the paper closer. And then I reached the part that truly undid me. He wrote about the future. He wrote about how no matter what happened, he wanted me to remember that I deserved to be loved, that life would still hold goodness, even if it changed shape, that I was stronger than I realized and kinder than I gave myself credit for. He told me not to disappear into grief. He told me to keep going, softly, gently, but bravely. It was like he had known, like he had written this letter for the version of me sitting on the bed right now, decades later, holding his words like a lifeline. My hands shook. I pressed the letter against my chest as if it could reach my heart more directly that way, and I cried. Not the dramatic kind, the honest kind, the kind that happens when love and loss meet in the same breath. In that moment, I wasn't just an elderly woman cleaning her wardrobe. I was a wife again. I was young again. I was loved again. And I realized that grief never truly ends. It simply becomes quieter until something touches it and makes it speak. And when grief speaks, it doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers in the language of small details, the curve of handwriting, the fold of paper, the scent that rises from old fabric. I sat there on the edge of the bed, the letter pressed to my chest, and for a long moment I didn't move at all. I simply let myself feel. I let the tears come the way rain comes to dry ground, not to destroy it, but to soften it. After a while, I unfolded the letter again with trembling fingers. I wanted to read it once more, not because I didn't understand it the first time, but because it felt like listening to him breathe. The words were ordinary on the surface, but filled with the kind of love that doesn't need decoration. He had never been a man of dramatic speeches. His love always lived in actions, in quiet help, in steady presence, in the way he made space for me to be exactly who I was. Reading the letter again felt like stepping into a warm room I thought I'd lost. There were parts I didn't remember, sentences that made me laugh softly through tears. He mentioned a small argument we once had about the way I folded towels and how he secretly loved how serious I got about the smallest things. He wrote that my stubbornness was one of the most beautiful forms of loyalty he'd ever seen. I could almost hear his gentle teasing, the way he would smile with his whole face when he thought I wasn't looking. I realized then that I had spent years remembering him in big snapshots, weddings, hospital rooms, final days. But the letter reminded me of the in-between moments, the normal moments, the ones that actually made up the majority of our life together. a shared cup of tea, a Sunday morning, a quiet walk, a hand reaching for another hand without even thinking. And suddenly, the ache inside me shifted. It didn't disappear, but it changed shape, turning from sharp pain into a softer longing, the kind that can exist beside gratitude. I stayed seated for a long time. The house around me was silent. Outside the window, the day continued. People moved through their lives without knowing what was happening inside my little room, and there was something strange about that, the way the world keeps turning even when time stops inside a person. I thought about all the times I had passed that coat in the wardrobe without touching it, how many seasons it had hung there quietly, holding this letter, waiting for me to be ready. Maybe I wasn't ready then, but I was ready now. Eventually, I stood up and carried the letter to the kitchen table. That table had seen so much of my life: meals, family gatherings, children doing homework, hands pressed together in prayer during difficult times. I placed the letter down gently and smoothed it with my palm as if I were calming a living thing. Then I looked around the room. I saw the kettle. I saw the chair by the window. I saw the old clock ticking steadily, faithful as ever. And I realized how much of my life had become quiet survival. I had learned how to keep going, yes, but I had also learned how to make myself small, how to move through days without expecting anything, how to accept silence as normal. The letter challenged that, not in a harsh way, in a loving way. He had written, "Don't disappear into grief. Keep going, softly, gently, but bravely." I had been going, but I wasn't sure I had been brave. I had been careful. I had been responsible. I had been strong. But bravery sometimes looks like allowing yourself to feel again, allowing yourself to reach outward instead of always turning inward. I poured myself another cup of tea and sat down. I read the letter again, this time slower, letting each line settle in me. I tried to imagine him sitting somewhere writing it. What day had it been? What had he been thinking? Had he been smiling? Had he paused before writing my name? Had he folded the paper carefully, thinking it might someday comfort me? It moved me to realize that love can plan comfort for the future. I looked back at the coat, still lying on the bed. For years I had avoided that coat because it carried too many memories, but now it felt different. It felt like a messenger, not of pain, but of love that still wanted to speak. I thought about my children and grandchildren busy in their own lives. I thought about how rarely I told them about my deeper feelings anymore. I didn't want to burden them. I didn't want to appear weak. But suddenly, sitting there with this letter, I realized that sharing memories is not a burden. It is a gift. It is how love travels forward. That evening, I took out an old photo album. I placed it on the table beside the letter. The photographs inside were worn and faded, but the faces still held life. I saw myself younger, smiling with bright eyes. I saw my husband with his arm around me, looking proud and playful. I saw our children as little ones, messy and happy. I saw moments that once had been present and now lived only in paper and memory. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like those memories were locked behind glass. They felt reachable. I ran my finger along one photograph and whispered his name softly, not as a cry, but as a greeting. It comforted me to say it. It reminded me that love doesn't vanish with death. It changes form. It becomes memory. It becomes lessons. It becomes the quiet strength that stays with you. Later that night, when I lay in bed, the letter rested on my bedside table. I couldn't stop thinking about it. My mind kept returning to his words, especially the part about the future. As I drifted toward sleep, I realized something important. The past wasn't trying to pull me backward. It was trying to hold my hand while I continued forward. The next morning, I woke up and reached for the letter before I even reached for my tea. I read it again, and something inside me felt steadier, as if his love had traveled through time to meet me here. And meeting me here, in this quiet season of my life, felt like the kindest thing he could have done. I carried the letter with me around the house that day, folding it carefully and placing it in my apron pocket as if I were afraid the world might take it away again. Every time my hand brushed it, I felt grounded, not because it erased pain, but because it reminded me that I had been loved deeply, and that kind of love leaves traces that do not disappear. As the day moved forward, I began to look at my home differently, not as a place where time had slowed down, but as a place filled with evidence of a life lived. The chair by the window wasn't just a chair. It was where I had once rocked babies to sleep, where I had once waited for my husband to come home, where I had once sat late at night listening to the house breathe. The kitchen table wasn't just furniture. It was a witness. It had seen celebrations, arguments, apologies, and forgiveness. And now it held a letter that felt like a bridge between then and now. I realized that the past is not always something we should avoid. Sometimes it returns not to break us, but to remind us of who we have been, and therefore who we still are. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't planned to do. I called my daughter. When she answered, her voice was busy, warm, slightly rushed, as most grown children's voices become. I could hear life happening in the background. But when she heard the softness in my tone, she slowed down. "Mom?" she asked. "Are you okay?" I took a breath. "I'm okay," I said. I found something today in an old coat pocket." "A coat pocket?" she repeated, curious. "Yes," I said, and my throat tightened gently. "A letter from your father." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and suddenly the background noise felt far away. "Oh," she whispered, as if the word itself carried years of emotion. I told her about the letter, about the handwriting, about the first line that undid me. I didn't tell her everything at once. I simply shared enough, and as I spoke, I felt something shift inside me. Not grief, but connection. It felt like opening a window that had been closed for too long. My daughter grew quiet, then said softly, "I didn't know he wrote you letters." I smiled through tears. "Neither did I admitted. Maybe that's the point. Sometimes love leaves gifts we don't even know we have." She asked if she could come by later in the week. I said yes, and when we ended the call, I felt lighter. I realized that sharing memories doesn't make them heavier. It makes them warmer. It allows love to circulate instead of sitting still. That evening, I returned the letter to the table and read it again, slowly, letting each line settle into me like warmth. I thought about all the versions of me that had existed since the day he wrote it. The younger me, still full of plans. The middle-aged me, busy and tired but determined. The older me, learning how to live with silence. And now, this version, sitting quietly with his words in my hands, realizing that the past had not abandoned me. I took out a clean piece of paper and a pen. For a long moment, I just stared at the blank page. Then, without fully thinking it through, I began to write. Not to him exactly, not in a way I expected him to answer, but in a way that felt honest. I wrote about the day I found the letter. I wrote about how I cried. I wrote about how his handwriting made me feel young again. I wrote about how I missed him, but also how grateful I was that I had known him. I wrote about how I sometimes feared becoming invisible as I aged, but how his words reminded me that love never makes a person invisible. Love leaves marks. Love leaves echoes. As I finished, I folded my page and placed it beside his letter. 2 pieces of paper, 2 voices, 2 parts of one story. As night fell, the house grew quiet again, but it didn't feel empty. It felt full, full of meaning, full of memory, full of love that still had the power to reach across time. Before bed, I returned the letter to the coat pocket, not because I wanted to hide it, but because it felt right. That coat had been holding it faithfully for years. It deserved to hold it a little longer, and somehow, knowing where it was, brought me comfort. It felt like a secret I could visit whenever I needed to remember. The next morning, I sat by the window with my tea. The sun was warmer today, brighter, and it poured softly on the floor like a blessing. I watched it for a long time. Then I opened the letter one more time and read the final lines again. He had written about the future, about goodness still waiting, about me continuing gently and bravely. I realized that those words were not instructions. They were permission. Permission to live without guilt. Permission to smile without apology. Permission to let love be something that nourishes rather than something that only aches. And as I sat there, silver hair catching the morning light, letter in my hands, I felt a small smile appear on my face. Not a big smile, not one meant to impress anyone, just a quiet, peaceful smile that said, "I am still here." Because sometimes the past doesn't return to pull us backward. Sometimes it returns to remind us that we have been loved and that we are still capable of living with that love inside us. And that is what I learned from a forgotten letter in a coat pocket. It brought tears, yes, but it also brought warmth. It brought me back to myself. It reminded me that love doesn't end. It waits, it echoes, it returns when we are ready. And as the sunlight warmed my hands near the window, I whispered a thank you into the quiet, and I let my heart rest.